Research is now discovering that high self esteem is actually something that none of us should be pursuing. And further, that self esteem isn't even about self love or self acceptance. Let me ask you a question. If you were to say bomb a presentation at work or at school, what do you say to yourself? Do you give yourself support and love, or are you impatient and tough on yourself? Like a lot of neurodivergent people, I struggle with my self-esteem. And I think a lot of people think that if you are a gifted neurodivergent person, then you automatically are going to have high self-esteem because you're, good at school. Maybe you figured out a way to escape some of the social criticisms and meet the neurotypical standard of success. I can tell you from personal experience and research that is not true. All it does is create maladaptive perfectionism, which basically means that you get convinced that if you just had better grades, or you're more organized, or your house was neater, or you were more productive, then somewhere in like the cosmic calculation of the universe and what makes us important as people, you're a more worthy person. Which means your sense of self-worth is highly changeable and fragile. If you do well in school or at work, then you feel great and self-esteem goes up. If someone makes a nasty comment or you get embarrassed and feel ashamed about a STEM behavior, then self-esteem goes down. So it's like a roller coaster. You go up, you go down, you go up, you go down. Let me ask you another question. When you have feelings of inadequacy, do you remind yourself that everyone feels inadequate at some point? Or do you think that everyone else has an easier job of it and that you're just effective? As neurodivergent people, we learn pretty quickly to be proud of the things that make us normal and ashamed of the things that sets us apart. And what that does is you're always looking outside of yourself for other people to tell you whether or not you're worthy, whether or not you're doing it right, and whether or not you're a valuable person. So clinically, and your doctor or clinician should be looking at this, we look for signs of chronic low self-esteem, particularly in people who have neurodivergence, because that chronic low self-esteem leads to, of course, chronic stress. Research is now showing us that chronic stress changes the structure and the electrical signaling in the brain in a way that causes depression. And that's why neurodivergent people oftentimes are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. It's the chronic stress of worrying if you are good enough, or even that you might be too much for people to deal with. Oh, people oftentimes either act or pretend that they don't understand rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria. But if you think about it in the context of being neurodivergent, you're interacting with a person who's been told that the external world is there to tell them how to behave and whether or not they are acceptable or worthy or valuable. So every social interaction is not just you and I talking. It's you trying to do every single thing right so that you can prove your self-worth. And in that case, rejection isn't, oh, this isn't for me. Rejection is, I'm worthless. And that's exactly why you see those high intensity pain signals in the brains of ADHDers that are experiencing rejection sensitivity dysphoria. The stakes are totally different at that level. Final question. When you fail at something that's important to you, do you try to keep things in perspective, or do you obsess and fixate over everything that is wrong? If you were to open up Google and search things to boost your self-esteem, you would find all kinds of tips and tricks, from motivational poses to mantras you can stick on your mirror. And I don't think anyone stopped to think, and I certainly did not, is high self-esteem something that we should be encouraging everyone to pursue? What is self-esteem really, and what is it not? Research is now discovering that high self-esteem is actually something that none of us should be pursuing. And further, that self-esteem isn't even about self-love or self-acceptance. I know, I had the same exact feeling that I get when someone tells me that something I eat every single day causes cancer. The word esteem comes from the Latin word estimate or appraise, which means that self-esteem is literally your way of estimating your social rank by figuring out whether you're superior or inferior. And that's another reason why social media has such a huge impact on self-esteem, because you're literally scrolling, ranking yourself subconsciously or consciously over and over again. It's also one of the reasons that self-esteem is associated with a higher risk of narcissism, because if you have really high self-esteem, then you've ranked yourself as highly, highly superior, and that is basically the foundational element of narcissistic personality disorder. In fact, levels of narcissism have actually risen 30% since the creation of TV and social media. And that makes sense because with TV and social media, we can now rank ourselves to people all over the world. Also, on the other side of that, depression and anxiety have increased because we can now rank ourselves all over the world. So if self-esteem is not the answer, what is the answer? How do we measure it? And how do we get better at it? Let's get into it. Those 3 sets of questions I asked you, I know you already forgot, but I asked you 3, are designed to get you to think about how you treat yourself in 3 different domains. So the first is self-kindness versus self-judgment, which is quieting that inner critic and reminding ourselves that making mistakes and not being good at everything is just part of the human experience. The second is common humanity versus isolation, which is just realizing that if you're struggling, we all struggling. And if you don't believe it, come here. I might not always look like I'm struggling, but there's some struggle to be had. And the third is mindfulness versus over-identification, which is just maintaining objective awareness of your setbacks so that you can learn from them instead of letting them define you for who you are today and what you might be capable of in the future. All 3 domains are part of self-compassion, which, unlike self-esteem, studies have shown that more is actually better. The higher your self-compassion, the less you're likely to do social comparison, the less self-conscious you are, and the less likely you are to obsess and fixate and ruminate on your setbacks. You can think of self-compassion as an emotional regulatory system. It's there in case, when self-esteem fails, because self-esteem is highly changeable. So when your self-esteem takes a back seat, instead of you going to the lowest of lows, self-compassion can help you keep things in perspective so that you don't bottom all the way out. Now, if you're like me, I always thought my inner critic was like this tough love friend. She was gonna make sure that I recognized all my mistakes and I got better. But I didn't realize how much energy it was taking away from me to constantly beat up on myself. It took, I'm not even gonna play with y'all. It takes, because I'm still in process too. It takes time to transform that kind of thinking, but it's 1000% possible. And I'm gonna talk about how. Step 1, get an idea of where you are now. In the description, I'm including a link to the 26 question self-compassion scale. It has been studied extensively. So much science went into it, and it's going to ask you questions that are designed to help you measure where you are in those 3 domains so you know where you're already kind of okay versus where you need to put a little bit more focus as you start this self-compassion journey. Step 2, just become a non-judgmental observer of how you live your life and what you say to yourself. So you want to be aware of what happens when you are self-critical. What are you saying to yourself? How do you feel? Just be a non-judgmental observer. Most of this stuff is going to happen in the background. It's like part of our old programming, and you're not even going to realize that it's happening, but it is. For me, I learned that anytime I responded defensively or with impatience to something, typically it was because there was fear or embarrassment, and a lot of that had to do with how I myself was going to judge or criticize myself if whatever was happening turned out to be true. So you'll get a sense of what kinds of emotional signals indicate that you are being self-critical, and then when you do, just observe, take note. It's really nothing to do for now, but you want to be aware of them as you start working on, again, your self-compassion journey. Step 3, get support, get educated. The research is showing us that as simple as learning about your neurodivergence can actually improve self-compassion because you realize you're not crazy and that there is actually something going on and your experience is different. So read books, listen to podcasts, join a support group, connect with others that have the neurodivergent experience so that you don't feel alone. If you want to go the professional route, you can certainly hire a therapist, specifically one that does a special type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. You'll want to ask about that up front. And then, of course, I'm always here. You can learn from me, learn from any content creator that you trust, and build community there. That's it for this week. See you next week. Bye.